When she laughed ATME and said I'd never get out of retail, I smiled, hiding the hurt behind quiet determination. My days had always started early, working the small retail store that I had taken after college. The shelves were stocked with products I barely cared about, and the long hours of standing on cold tile floors, helping customers, and enduring constant complaints made me question why I had even chosen this path. Yet it was my reality, and I had learned to accept it with as much grace as I could muster. She was my coworker, someone I had known since my first day on the job. Confident, smart, and sharp-tongued, she had a way of making everyone feel small, and somehow I had become her favorite target. "You'll never make it out of this place," she had said one afternoon, leaning on the counter, her voice sharp but amused. I forced a polite smile, nodding as if I agreed, while my mind quietly started planning. At that moment, I made a silent promise to myself. One day, I would change the circumstances, and I would do it on my own terms. The weeks that followed were a blur of long shifts, late nights, and small savings tucked away in a drawer. Each time she laughed at my choices or commented on my slow progression, I felt a sting, but I also felt a quiet fire ignite within me. I began to notice the patterns in our work, the inefficiencies, the gaps in management, and the ways our store could actually make more money if it were run differently. I started jotting down notes during breaks, observing customer habits, product placement, and staff scheduling. Slowly, the seed of an idea took root. My dream wasn't just to leave retail, it was to create opportunities for myself, to build something bigger than any of us had imagined. And yet, I couldn't show my hand. The ridicule was still fresh, the environment still unkind, and any hint of ambition would only invite more mockery. So I worked quietly, honing my knowledge of business, reading about real estate, property management, and investment strategies at night after closing the store. I learned about mortgages, property values, and tenant rights. I studied market trends and noted which neighborhoods were expanding and which areas had steady demand. While everyone else was focused on daily tasks, I was slowly laying the foundation for a future that even she couldn't see coming. Months passed, and I started small. I found a modest property, one that others overlooked, and I purchased it with careful savings and a small loan. It wasn't much at first, but it was mine. I repaired it, cleaned it, and rented it to a tenant who respected the space. Each successful step built my confidence, even as I continued to clock long hours at the retail store. Every time she scoffed or remarked on my limited career prospects, I smiled silently, knowing that my quiet work was already turning the tide. Slowly, my portfolio grew. I reinvested profits from rent, looked for undervalued properties, and started learning the nuances of negotiation. I discovered that patience and consistency, applied over time, were more powerful than sarcasm or ridicule. The contrast between our paths became more apparent as I expanded, and she remained in the same routine, unaware of how my quiet planning was shaping my future. I remember one evening, standing on the balcony of a small apartment I had purchased, watching the lights of the city flicker below. I thought of her words, the ones that had stung so deeply. "You'll never get out of retail." I allowed myself a private smile, not out of revenge, but out of quiet satisfaction. The fire she had unknowingly ignited in me had fueled years of learning, planning, and patient action. Years of late nights studying, days of careful observation, and weekends spent visiting properties had compounded into a tangible reality. I was building independence, security, and a future she had claimed I would never reach. And yet, I never let arrogance creep in. I remained humble, understanding that the journey was ongoing, that every success required thoughtful decisions, and that the true power of change comes quietly, almost invisibly, before anyone notices. One day, she mentioned that her landlord had raised the rent, and she seemed frustrated, complaining to other coworkers. I listened silently, recognizing the irony but holding back any outward reaction. I wasn't ready to reveal my growth yet. That day, I realized something profound. The satisfaction wouldn't come from her shock or embarrassment. It would come from the knowledge that I had quietly transformed my life while she remained unaware. My work continued, my properties grew, and each tenant who moved in brought me stability and incremental success. I was no longer just surviving retail. I was building a network of assets, knowledge, and independence that would one day allow me to step away entirely. I began mentoring others quietly, sharing knowledge about managing money, negotiating leases, and improving credit, but always subtly, without drawing attention to my eventual end goal. In my spare moments, I imagined the day I could leave retail for good. It wasn't revenge I sought, it was freedom, dignity, and the quiet joy of knowing I had overcome doubt, ridicule, and limitation through patience and intelligence. And that day, though still in the distance, began to feel closer with each property acquired, each small tenant success, and each quiet decision made with care. As I left the store one late evening, the empty streets reflecting the city lights, I realized that the journey was already a success, not because anyone else acknowledged it, but because I had quietly taken control of my life. Humiliation had become a catalyst, mockery had become motivation, and patience had become power. And as I walked home, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel gratitude for the lessons learned, and to acknowledge the quiet pride that comes from building something meaningful, step by step, without anyone noticing. Yet, that silent promise I had made to myself all those years ago to never be confined by the limits others set was already unfolding, quietly, patiently, inevitably. And I knew, deep down, that one day she would realize the full measure of the life I had built, while she had remained blind to it. The weeks after that evening passed slowly, each one filled with the familiar rhythm of the retail store, the constant hum of fluorescent lights, and the chatter of customers I had grown used to guiding. I kept my plans close, hidden beneath the routine of scanning items, restocking shelves, and politely smiling through complaints. Every interaction, every glance from my coworker who had mocked me, felt like a quiet challenge. I couldn't show ambition yet, not openly. She thrived on attention and took subtle pleasure in the doubt she planted in others. But I had learned to work silently, letting the world believe I was content in a place I had long outgrown in spirit, if not yet in circumstance. Slowly, I began to expand my knowledge. I read about real estate laws, property investment strategies, and tenant management in small bursts during breaks or late at night after closing. I learned which neighborhoods had potential for growth, which landlords were flexible, and how to negotiate a fair deal without drawing attention. My curiosity grew, and what had started as a private escape from humiliation became a careful, deliberate plan to secure independence. Every day I was in the store, I observed people's habits, how they moved through spaces, what they valued, what they ignored. I realized these small observations were lessons in human behavior, lessons that could help me as I built my own ventures. I began saving every extra dollar I could. The margins were small, but they accumulated quietly, tucked away in a separate account. Each deposit was a reminder that I was taking control of my future, one patient step at a time. Meanwhile, my coworker continued her routine, seemingly unaware of the quiet transformation happening beside her. She would still make remarks about my limited prospects or joke about how retail would be my life forever. At first, these words stung sharply, but over time they became fuel. Instead of anger, I felt resolve. Instead of shame, I felt motivation. Each comment was a reminder of the path I was choosing, not one of confrontation, but one of quiet, deliberate action. One day, while browsing properties online, I noticed a small, neglected building for sale in a growing neighborhood. Most people would have passed it over because of its age and minor structural issues, but I saw potential. I did research, calculated numbers, and imagined what it could become. I made a plan to purchase it using my savings and a small loan, careful to keep the transaction quiet. When the deal was finalized, I felt a quiet thrill. It wasn't just about owning property, it was about proving to myself, not anyone else, that persistence and careful planning could create real change. I spent evenings and weekends fixing the building, painting walls, repairing leaks, and ensuring everything was functional and inviting for potential tenants. It was tiring work but fulfilling. Each nail hammered, each repair completed, and each tenant who moved in reminded me of the distance I had traveled from that first day of humiliation. As my confidence grew, so did my portfolio. I reinvested earnings into more properties, carefully studying each opportunity and negotiating every deal with patience and precision. I stayed humble, knowing that growth required diligence, not showiness. During this time, my coworker continued to comment on my so-called limited career, unaware that I was quietly becoming her landlord in the making. Occasionally, I would hear complaints from tenants about other landlords raising rent or neglecting repairs. I thought of the irony, but I never let it slip in conversation. I was building a quiet, personal victory that didn't need to be broadcast. Every success added to my momentum. I learned not only the technical aspects of property management, but also the subtle human side: how to communicate with tenants, how to resolve conflicts calmly, and how to maintain respect and dignity in every interaction. These lessons, I realized, were even more valuable than the financial gains. One late evening, I sat in my first property, now fully rented and generating steady income. The quiet of the space, the faint hum of the city outside, and the knowledge of what I had accomplished brought a deep sense of satisfaction. I thought back to her mocking words, to the skepticism of coworkers, and even the doubts I had felt myself in the early days. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was action, patience, and persistence. Slowly, the rhythm of my dual life, the day job in retail and the growing portfolio of properties became routine. I could have left retail at any point, but I stayed deliberately. Every day there was an opportunity to learn, observe, and save. Every encounter, every challenge in the store was another piece of experience that would serve me later. Over time, I also began sharing small insights with trusted friends who had quietly asked about my work. I didn't boast, and I didn't seek recognition. Instead, I offered guidance, mentoring others in managing small investments, teaching them patience and diligence. Watching them succeed gave me a quiet joy I hadn't anticipated. Months turned into a couple of years. My properties grew, my income became more reliable, and the idea of leaving retail for good became increasingly realistic. I still endured her remarks, but they no longer held power. I had learned the essential truth: consistent action, even if invisible to others, builds undeniable results. One day she mentioned she had trouble with her landlord, complaining about rent increases. I simply smiled quietly, knowing the full measure of irony. It wasn't about showing off or revenge. It was about the satisfaction of achieving something she had insisted was impossible. The transformation in my life had been steady, almost imperceptible to those around me, but it was real and profound. Every decision, every investment, every lesson learned had compounded into a future she could not have foreseen. That realization brought a subtle, enduring contentment. By quietly observing, learning, and acting with patience, I had built independence, dignity, and a path forward that didn't rely on anyone's approval or recognition. And though the day she would discover the full measure of my success was still ahead, I didn't dwell on it. My joy was internal, steady, and deeply personal. I had turned humiliation into motivation, mockery into quiet strategy, and doubt into opportunity. I realized, finally, that real success doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from proving yourself right through consistent effort, integrity, and patience. As I closed the door of the retail store one evening, locking it behind me, I paused and allowed myself a deep breath. The street was quiet, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement from a recent rain. I smiled softly, knowing that the years of quiet planning, hard work, and careful patience were coming to fruition. The path ahead was still long, but I had already traveled farther than anyone, including myself, could have imagined on that first day she mocked my career. And in that quiet satisfaction, I understood the first real lesson of my journey: that the power of persistence, patience, and quiet determination can turn the smallest beginnings into life-changing outcomes, without the need for anger, confrontation, or spectacle. By the time I had quietly built a small but steady portfolio of properties, the sense of accomplishment was profound, yet subtle. The retail store remained my daily routine, a space where I could observe, learn, and remain invisible to those who doubted me. She continued to mock, to comment on my limited prospects, to laugh at what she believed was my stagnant life. Yet, behind the calm, polite smile I offered her each day, I carried a quiet strength that no sarcasm could touch. My properties were generating income, growing in value, and most importantly, giving me a sense of control and independence I had never felt while standing behind the cash register. One day, while reviewing the financial statements of my first few properties, I realized the potential to expand faster than I had imagined. Carefully, I started exploring commercial spaces, small shops, and even office units that were underpriced, neglected, or simply overlooked. Each opportunity became a puzzle to solve, evaluating costs, estimating returns, understanding local tenants' needs, and negotiating quietly without alerting anyone. It was thrilling, but I never let it show. At work, I remained the same polite, diligent employee, seemingly content with my position in retail. Yet, every week, every hour outside the store was dedicated to research, property visits, and management. Slowly, my properties were beginning to generate enough income that I could consider leaving retail entirely, but I held back deliberately. The timing had to be precise. I didn't want to announce my success prematurely. I wanted the moment when it mattered most, when the results would speak louder than anyone's mockery. A couple of years into my quiet strategy, one of my tenants moved into a commercial unit I had acquired in a busy part of town. She had been looking for a space to open a small boutique, and I offered her a reasonable lease with clear terms and support. When she moved in, I visited the property occasionally, checking that everything was functioning properly. Each time I noticed the building thriving, people coming in, tenants satisfied, and my investment steadily increasing in value. The sense of progress was slow but deeply rewarding. Meanwhile, my coworker continued in retail, seemingly unchanged in her routine. She still commented on my work, occasionally laughing at my slow progress or questioning my ambitions, but I had grown immune to her words. Instead of anger, I felt clarity. Her skepticism had long since stopped being a barrier. It was merely a reminder of how far I had already come. The real turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, I received a call from a property developer I had met months before. He was looking for potential investors and properties to acquire in the neighborhood where I owned a few units. He praised the strategic locations, the careful upkeep, and the income stability of my portfolio. The conversation shifted quickly from casual discussion to serious business. Within weeks, we had formalized a partnership that allowed me to expand my properties at a pace I had only dreamed of. Suddenly, the small portfolio I had been managing alone transformed into a network of investments that brought visibility, influence, and real financial growth. And then, it happened. One day, while walking past the retail store, I overheard her conversation with another coworker. She was frustrated, talking about how she was struggling to find affordable commercial space for her own plans. She didn't know that I now owned several units in the area, some just a block away from her target locations. I paused silently, feeling the subtle irony. This wasn't about revenge. It was about seeing how life unfolds when persistence, patience, and quiet action finally meet opportunity. She eventually approached me under the pretense of casual conversation, asking if I knew any available spaces in the area. I smiled gently, offering guidance while remaining calm and professional. "There are a few spaces opening soon," I said, pointing out the options without revealing that I was the landlord for multiple properties. I watched her expression carefully, nodding the faint spark of curiosity mixed with frustration. She had no idea that the person she had mocked for years was now in a position of quiet authority and control. Over the next few months, her frustration grew. Every time she looked for affordable space, she encountered obstacles. Meanwhile, my properties continued to thrive, and my tenants were satisfied, paying on time, and praising the well-kept units. My success was subtle but undeniable. I began to see the deeper lesson unfold. The real impact of my efforts wasn't in humiliation or confrontation, but in creating a reality that naturally shifted the balance of power. She still didn't know, yet the circumstances were beginning to show her the consequences of underestimating others. I continued to expand strategically, reinvesting profits, acquiring new properties, and improving management practices. My understanding of human behavior, negotiations, and market trends grew stronger with each interaction. What had started as a quiet plan to escape ridicule had evolved into a sophisticated approach to business and personal independence. One evening, as I reviewed the latest financial report from my portfolio, I realized that my quiet strategy had reached a point where I could make a significant life change. I didn't need the retail store anymore. The decision wasn't impulsive. It was calculated, patient, and deliberate. I gave my notice the next day, politely thanking my manager and colleagues for the years of experience, while keeping the details of my success private. Walking out of the store for the last time was bittersweet. There was relief, yes, but also reflection on how much I had learned during those years. The retail world had taught me patience, observation, and endurance. It had been the crucible in which my quiet strategy had been forged. Weeks later, as I walked past the neighborhood where my properties were located, I noticed new businesses thriving in spaces I had acquired, tenants happy and bustling, and the subtle realization of control and influence I now held. It wasn't a victory announced with fanfare. It was a life quietly transformed through diligence and strategic action. And then the moment of subtle reckoning arrived. She called me, asking if I could help her find a space that fit her needs. I agreed, calmly, and arranged a viewing at one of my buildings. When she arrived and saw the property, the recognition hit her slowly. Her eyes widened slightly, her expression shifting from curiosity to understanding. I smiled politely and said, "It's available with reasonable terms." She was quiet for a moment, absorbing the reality she had overlooked for years. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice or mock her. The moment was powerful precisely because it was quiet and deliberate. She realized in her own way that the person she had dismissed, mocked, and underestimated was now in a position of control and opportunity, one that had been earned through patience, careful planning, and perseverance. That night, I reflected on the journey. The ridicule had been painful, the doubts disheartening, and the path long. But each step, each quiet action had compounded into a transformation I could be proud of. I understood finally that the true impact of humiliation lies not in immediate revenge, but in allowing it to become fuel for sustained, meaningful action. My life had changed, not because I wanted her to feel small, but because I chose to act, plan, and grow while remaining calm and focused. And as I looked at the neighborhood, my properties thriving, my tenants happy, and my own confidence quietly soaring, I understood that this was only the beginning. The subtle power of patience, diligence, and quiet determination had created a reality she could no longer ignore, and I knew that the lessons learned would guide me through every future endeavor. In that quiet moment, I allowed myself a soft smile, realizing that true success never needs to be shouted. It speaks for itself, eventually reaching those who doubted it in its own perfect timing. The weeks following our first encounter at one of my properties were quietly transformative, both for me and, indirectly, for her. She didn't say much at first, but I could sense a subtle shift in her demeanor whenever she spoke to me. It wasn't outright admiration, far from it, but there was a mix of curiosity, hesitation, and the faintest glimmer of realization. She was beginning to understand, without me ever having to point it out, that the person she had ridiculed, underestimated, and dismissed for years was now operating on a completely different plane. I continued to manage my properties carefully, keeping everything professional and above board. Each tenant interaction, each maintenance check, each financial decision was deliberate and precise. I had grown into the role of a landlord who was respected, reliable, and quietly influential in my neighborhood. The irony of our paths diverging was not lost on me. Every time she complained about a landlord or struggled to find a suitable commercial space, I felt a calm, steady satisfaction, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because life had, in its own way, demonstrated the consequences of underestimating someone who quietly works toward their goals. Over the next few months, I noticed her checking in more often, asking subtle questions about property trends, investment opportunities, and potential spaces for her projects. She was cautious, careful not to reveal too much of her curiosity, but her interest was unmistakable. I answered politely, always professional, always calm. I had no desire to embarrass her publicly. The power lay in quiet observation, in letting her recognize the change for herself. It became clear that she was beginning to respect the work I had done, even if she didn't say it outright. Her questions revealed her admiration, tempered with lingering skepticism. She still carried the same sharp tongue, the same quick wit, but now it was tempered by a recognition that she couldn't ignore the reality I had built. One afternoon, she approached me after work, asking for advice about a space she was considering leasing. I smiled softly and listened, carefully explaining the benefits and drawbacks without revealing that I owned multiple properties in the area. Her face showed frustration mixed with curiosity. She didn't know the full extent of my influence, and the irony of the situation was deeply satisfying, even in its quiet subtlety. I began to realize that my patience had created not just financial success, but a shift in the balance of power between us. She had once been the one who mocked and belittled, and now she relied, at least in part, on the expertise and resources I had quietly cultivated. My life outside the store had expanded. I was investing in new properties, mentoring tenants, and occasionally advising friends who were curious about real estate. Each success was deliberate, a carefully calculated step toward independence, dignity, and long-term stability. I felt a quiet joy in knowing that the work I had done, often invisible to others, had created real, tangible outcomes that were starting to influence the lives of people around me, including her. The turning point came when she finally faced a critical moment in her own career. She had been offered a small commercial space for her boutique, but the lease terms were steep, and the landlord was inflexible. She came to me, not as a peer or rival, but seeking practical guidance. I remained calm and neutral, showing her the options, explaining what would make sense financially, and guiding her without revealing that I had owned several buildings that could accommodate her needs perfectly. Watching her wrestle with the situation, I realized the full weight of years of planning, patience, and quiet effort. The sense of accomplishment was profound, yet subtle. I didn't need to gloat or assert dominance. The situation spoke for itself. She was forced to confront the reality that her former mockery and assumptions about my limitations had been completely wrong. I was no longer the person she had dismissed. I was a landlord, an investor, and a quietly respected professional who controlled opportunities she desperately needed. Over the next few weeks, our interactions became more frequent. She asked for advice about leases, tenants, and negotiations, and I provided guidance calmly and professionally. I noticed a subtle shift in her tone, respect, curiosity, and even a hint of hesitation when she addressed me. She was learning, perhaps unconsciously, that patience, diligence, and persistence could quietly transform a life. Meanwhile, my other properties continued to generate steady income. I was reinvesting, expanding, and diversifying my portfolio, all while maintaining a calm, professional demeanor. The transformation in my own life was remarkable. I had gone from standing behind a cash register, enduring ridicule, to building a network of investments, influence, and financial stability that would allow me true independence. Yet I remained grounded. I never flaunted my success. I didn't make her feel small or belittle her in return. The power lay in subtlety, in letting results speak for themselves, and in understanding that the most satisfying victories are often quiet and invisible to those who once doubted you. One afternoon, she asked if she could tour one of my buildings for a potential lease. I agreed, maintaining professional courtesy, and walked her through the property. As she explored the space, her expression shifted from curiosity to mild shock. Slowly, she began to grasp the scope of what I had accomplished quietly over the years. I offered guidance on the layout, the rental terms, and the neighborhood trends, never revealing that I personally owned several nearby properties. She left with a mix of gratitude and realization, though she did not voice the depth of her surprise. The moment was perfectly silent, perfectly subtle. It was a quiet reckoning, a moment where the years of patient effort, careful investment, and thoughtful action had created a reality she could not have predicted. I reflected on the journey that evening, sitting in one of my properties as the sun set, casting soft light across the walls. The journey had been long, filled with quiet moments of observation, learning, and persistence. The ridicule I had once endured had been transformed into motivation, the mockery into a catalyst for deliberate action, and the doubt into a roadmap for growth. I understood finally that success doesn't require confrontation or revenge. It requires focus, patience, and the willingness to act quietly while others remain unaware. The subtle shifts in her demeanor, the questions she now asked, and the gradual recognition of my capabilities were all proof that the work I had done mattered. It mattered not for pride, but for the tangible change it brought to my life and indirectly to hers. By the time the month ended, she was negotiating spaces with landlords who were now competitors to my own buildings. Each decision she made, each challenge she faced, reminded me of how far I had come. I had taken control of my life without drama, without anger, and without anyone noticing the full extent of my growth. And in that quiet, deliberate action, I found peace, satisfaction, and an understanding of the real power of patience. Life had a way of revealing outcomes when the time was right, and I had learned to trust in the process. I had learned that quiet perseverance, careful planning, and diligent action often yield far greater rewards than any immediate confrontation or dramatic display. As I sat that evening, reviewing plans for additional acquisitions, I smiled softly, thinking of the journey from ridicule to respect. She had once said I would never escape retail, never grow, never succeed. Yet here I was, quietly shaping my own life, creating opportunities, and demonstrating through action what words alone could never convey. The subtle lesson was clear. Humility, patience, and persistent effort often speak louder than mockery or doubt. And the quiet satisfaction of seeing your own life transform, without needing to humiliate anyone in return, is the most profound victory of all. By the time I had fully settled into my role as a landlord and property investor, life had taken on a rhythm of quiet confidence. My properties were thriving, tenants were satisfied, and every financial decision I made added stability and freedom to my life. Yet, the most profound satisfaction came not from money or recognition, but from the quiet realization of how far I had come from the days of ridicule and mockery at the retail store. My coworker, the one who had laughed at my limited prospects, had become a subtle reflection of my former self, ambitious, frustrated, and slowly realizing the consequences of her own assumptions. It started with small moments. She would ask questions about lease terms, tenant expectations, or property management, always cautiously, always measuring her words. I answered calmly, offering guidance, never showing impatience, never revealing the full scope of what I had achieved. The power lay in subtlety, and I had learned that the most satisfying victories are often quiet, invisible, and patient. One afternoon, she called me urgently, her voice carrying frustration beneath a polite tone. She had found a property she liked, but the landlord's terms were unreasonable, and she was desperate for guidance. I listened carefully, asking questions to understand her needs, then suggested a solution that would work perfectly for her. She followed my advice, and within days she had secured the space, yet she had no idea that I personally owned other prime units in the same area, some of which were even better suited for her business. The irony was quiet but deeply satisfying. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The subtle realization of control, earned through years of careful planning and patience, was far more powerful than any display of triumph. Over the next few weeks, our interactions became more frequent. She asked for recommendations, guidance, and opinions, all while remaining unaware of the full extent of my portfolio. It was fascinating to watch her wrestle with the reality that someone she had once dismissed could now influence opportunities she desperately sought. Each encounter reinforced the lesson I had quietly learned. Success doesn't require confrontation, anger, or revenge. It requires patience, diligence, and the quiet accumulation of skills, knowledge, and influence. Then came the day that marked the true turning point. A major commercial developer announced a new project in the city, a prime opportunity for property investors. I had already prepared for this, having researched the area, secured preliminary financing, and identified potential properties to acquire. My timing was perfect. I attended the meeting, calm, composed, and ready. To my surprise, she was there too, representing a small business looking for prime rental space. She didn't recognize me immediately in the larger group, but when our eyes met, there was a fleeting moment of recognition, a subtle acknowledgement of the past, of the years when she had mocked and underestimated me. The meeting proceeded, and I quietly positioned myself strategically, acquiring properties that aligned perfectly with the new development. She, despite her best efforts, found herself limited by her lack of preparation and the competitive advantage I had quietly built. The irony was profound, yet I remained composed, professional, and calm. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about the quiet, undeniable reality of preparation, persistence, and strategic thinking. Weeks later, she finally realized the full scope of my influence. She approached me directly, cautiously, her tone mixed with frustration, curiosity, and an unspoken recognition of what I had achieved. "I had no idea you owned so much in this area," she admitted softly, almost whispering. I smiled politely, acknowledging her comment without gloating. "It's been a long process," I said simply. "Years of planning, patience, and careful action." She nodded slowly, taking in the truth she had once refused to see. That day, the dynamic between us shifted. She no longer spoke with mockery or condescension. Instead, there was a quiet respect, tempered with humility, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the transformation I had achieved. The realization was both gratifying and humbling. I understood fully that the journey had been mine, not for revenge, but for personal growth, independence, and dignity. Her recognition was secondary, a natural consequence of the effort I had invested in my own life. Over the following months, I continued to expand strategically, acquiring properties, mentoring tenants, and building networks. Each decision was deliberate, informed by years of observation and experience. She remained in the industry, still ambitious, still learning, now quietly seeking advice from the very person she had once dismissed. I offered guidance patiently, without judgment, understanding that everyone's journey unfolds differently. And then, one afternoon, she came to me with a dilemma. Her lease for a prime location had expired, and she faced steep increases from her landlord. She was desperate for a solution, and this time I held the key. I could have leveraged my position to assert control or extract advantage, but instead, I approached it with calm, professional empathy. I offered her a space I owned at a fair rate, helping her navigate the challenge without overtly demonstrating the power I held. The satisfaction I felt wasn't in seeing her struggle. It was in the quiet knowledge that my patience, diligence, and strategic action had created a position of influence that allowed me to help, guide, and lead. The subtle twist of fate was complete. The same person who had mocked me now relied in part on the careful planning and quiet success I had cultivated over years. That evening, as I reflected on the journey, I realized the true value of patience and persistence. The years of standing behind a cash register, enduring ridicule, and quietly planning my path had culminated in a life transformed, not by confrontation or anger, but by consistent, deliberate effort. The power wasn't in humiliation, it was in the quiet, unstoppable momentum of careful work. I understood finally that real success is measured not by immediate victories or dramatic confrontations, but by the steady accumulation of knowledge, skill, and opportunity. And in that quiet moment, I smiled softly, knowing that the life I had built, the independence I had earned, and the subtle shifts in perception around me were proof that persistence, patience, and quiet determination can overcome any mockery, any doubt, and any limitation. The journey was long, the path often invisible to those around me, but the rewards, freedom, dignity, and quiet influence were profound. And as I looked at the city from one of my properties, watching tenants move, businesses thrive, and opportunities unfold, I felt a deep sense of calm satisfaction. I had transformed humiliation into motivation, mockery into strategy, and doubt into a roadmap for success. And the most powerful realization of all was this: the quiet, patient work of building a life on your own terms is far more satisfying, enduring, and transformative than any instant victory could ever be. By the time I had fully established my portfolio and my presence in the city, life had settled into a rhythm of quiet control. My properties were thriving, tenants were satisfied, and every day brought small but steady reminders that I had turned years of ridicule and doubt into something tangible, stable, and meaningful. Yet, the most significant part of this journey was not the financial success itself, it was the transformation of perception, both my own and hers. She had once mocked me relentlessly, dismissed my ambition, and laughed at what she believed was my limited future. Now she approached me differently. Her questions were careful, her tone cautious, and there was a subtle hesitation in her demeanor that spoke volumes. She had begun to realize that the person she had underestimated was no longer the timid, insecure employee she once knew. My approach during these encounters remained calm and professional. I never flaunted my success, never belittled her, and never reminded her of the years she had spent mocking me. Instead, I allowed the results to speak quietly for themselves, and the results were undeniable. One afternoon, she came to me in a state of quiet frustration. Her boutique's lease had expired, and the landlord demanded a steep increase she could barely afford. She approached me as a last resort, seeking guidance. I listened patiently, taking in every detail of her predicament. I could have used this as an opportunity to assert dominance or indulge in subtle revenge, but I chose restraint. Instead, I offered a practical solution: a property I owned, available under fair terms, well suited to her needs. She looked surprised, perhaps even stunned, but she accepted my guidance. That moment was the culmination of years of careful planning, patience, and diligence. It wasn't about revenge or making her feel small. It was about the quiet assertion of control that had been earned, not taken. Over the following weeks, she settled into the space I provided, slowly realizing, without my intervention, that I held a level of influence she had never anticipated. The irony was profound. The woman who had ridiculed me for my supposed lack of ambition now relied, in part, on my expertise and resources. I observed this transformation with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't joy in her discomfort, but a deep understanding of cause and effect. The effort I had put into building my life had created a reality she could no longer ignore. My own life continued to expand. I acquired more properties, diversified into new areas, and strengthened relationships with tenants and investors. Every decision was deliberate, informed by years of observation, learning, and careful strategy. My confidence grew, not from arrogance, but from the certainty that patience and persistence pay off in ways that mockery and derision never can. Then came the day when she finally confronted the truth directly. She approached me cautiously in my office, her expression a mixture of curiosity, frustration, and something I hadn't seen before: genuine recognition of my accomplishments. I didn't realize. "You've built so much," she said softly, almost as if speaking aloud a truth she was reluctant to admit. I smiled, keeping my tone calm and neutral. "It's been a process," I replied simply. "Years of patience, planning, and steady effort." She nodded slowly, absorbing the truth, realizing that her previous assumptions had been completely wrong. There was no gloating in my words, no triumphalism. The power lay in the quiet demonstration of results. The realization in her eyes was profound. She had underestimated the very person who now held opportunities she desperately needed. And yet, she couldn't deny the reality. I offered guidance, advice, and practical solutions, helping her navigate her challenges while maintaining professional detachment. In this subtle exchange, a complete reversal had occurred. She had once been the one with confidence, mockery, and superiority. Now she was seeking guidance, negotiating terms, and depending, at least indirectly, on the quiet success I had cultivated over years. That evening, I reflected on the journey, the ridicule I had endured, the doubts I had faced, and the years spent quietly building my life had culminated in a transformation more profound than I had imagined. My independence, control, and quiet influence were proof that persistence and patience can quietly but powerfully overturn even the harshest judgments. I realized then that true power doesn't lie in confrontation or revenge. It lies in deliberate action, steady growth, and the quiet accumulation of skill, knowledge, and opportunity. My satisfaction was deep, calm, and enduring. Over the next months, I continued to expand strategically, acquiring new properties, mentoring tenants, and quietly observing her gradual adjustment to the reality she could no longer ignore. Every success, every tenant satisfied, every property leased was a quiet affirmation of the choices I had made, the diligence I had applied, and the patience I had exercised. One day she approached me again, this time with a request I could have easily denied. Her boutique needed a small expansion, and she asked for guidance on available options. I calmly offered a solution, pointing out a property I owned that fit her needs perfectly. She paused, hesitation in her eyes before accepting. She had no idea the scale of the portfolio she was now indirectly benefiting from. The satisfaction was subtle but profound. I had achieved the ultimate form of quiet leverage, influence without confrontation, authority without aggression, and respect without spectacle. That night, I sat alone in my office, reviewing the growing portfolio and reflecting on the path that had led me here. I remembered the mockery, the doubts, the whispered comments and laughter. They had once been painful, humiliating, and discouraging. Now they were distant echoes, replaced by calm satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment that no one could take away. I understood finally that the transformation wasn't about her realization or validation. It was about my own growth, the independence I had earned, and the quiet influence I had built through years of careful, patient effort. By the end of that week, she had fully acknowledged, in her own way, the reality she had once refused to see. She approached negotiations with greater caution, asked questions with newfound respect, and treated our interactions with humility and professionalism. The reversal was complete, and yet there was no bitterness in me, no desire to gloat or assert dominance. The victory was internal, calm, and deeply personal. I had turned humiliation into motivation, mockery into strategy, and doubt into deliberate action. The lessons I had learned along the way, patience, perseverance, and the power of quiet, consistent effort, were far more valuable than any financial gain or external recognition. As I looked at the city from one of my properties, the sun setting softly on the skyline, I smiled gently. The journey had been long, often invisible to those around me, but every step had been worth it. I had transformed not only my circumstances, but also the perception of the person who had once belittled me. Yet the most important realization of all was this: true success is measured not by the humiliation of others or immediate gratification, but by the quiet accumulation of skill, independence, and influence, results that speak for themselves when the time is right. And in that calm, reflective moment, I understood fully that the path I had chosen, the patience I had exercised, and the diligent effort I had invested had created a life far richer than any mockery could diminish, a life of quiet power, respect, and enduring satisfaction. By the time I reached this stage in my journey, life had taken on a rhythm of quiet authority. My properties were thriving, my tenants satisfied, and my network of investments had grown beyond anything I had imagined during those long days behind the retail counter. Each decision I made was deliberate, informed by years of observation, patience, and careful strategy. And yet, the most profound satisfaction came not from the money, but from the realization that I had turned ridicule into motivation, mockery into deliberate action, and doubt into undeniable success. She had begun to notice, of course. The subtle hints were everywhere. The way she asked questions about property markets, the cautious tone in her conversations, the hesitant glances when I mentioned opportunities or trends in the city. She didn't know the full extent of my holdings yet, but she was beginning to sense that I had quietly moved far beyond the limitations she once insisted I would never overcome. One day, she approached me with a desperate request. Her boutique, growing faster than she had anticipated, needed more space in a prime location. The landlord she approached was inflexible, demanding steep rent increases, and she was panicking. I listened patiently, absorbing every detail of her predicament. I could feel the subtle irony in the situation. The person who had once laughed at my small prospects was now relying, indirectly, on my expertise, guidance, and ultimately, the very network of properties I had built quietly over the years. I guided her through practical options, calmly pointing out suitable spaces, without revealing that I personally owned a prime property in the area, one that would perfectly fit her needs. I maintained professionalism, soft-spoken advice, and a composed demeanor. The real power lay in subtlety, in letting the situation unfold naturally, without boasting or gloating. Weeks passed, and she continued to struggle with her options. Meanwhile, my properties continued to flourish. Tenants were happy, rents were steady, and I had expanded strategically, carefully reinvesting profits to acquire key locations in emerging neighborhoods. The sense of control and independence was intoxicating, not in arrogance, but in quiet confidence. Then the pivotal moment arrived. A prime property, the very one she had dreamt of acquiring for her boutique, became available. I was the landlord. The irony was sweet but silent. I did not revel in her discomfort. I simply offered the space to her under fair and professional terms. Her reaction was immediate, subtle yet unmistakable. Her eyes widened slightly, her expression a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization. She had underestimated me, ignored my potential, and mocked my abilities for years. And now she was faced with the undeniable truth. I held the key to her most desired opportunity. I guided her through the lease agreement, maintaining calm professionalism. I answered her questions carefully, gently steering her to understand the terms while never revealing the full extent of my portfolio. The satisfaction was quiet, almost meditative. I wasn't gloating. The lesson she had once refused to learn was now evident, not because I forced it, but because life had unfolded in a way that revealed the results of patience, persistence, and diligent effort. Over the next few weeks, she settled into the space. Her boutique began to flourish, but now under my oversight. She continued to ask for advice and guidance, never again mocking or questioning my capability. The dynamic had shifted completely. She was now operating in a world influenced quietly but profoundly by my actions, decisions, and foresight. I reflected often on this journey. The years of humiliation, doubt, and ridicule had been painful, yes, but they had also provided the impetus for careful planning, resilience, and determination. I had learned to convert negativity into motivation, mockery into strategy, and doubt into a roadmap for growth. My life was no longer defined by others' opinions, but by deliberate, patient, and consistent action. One evening, I walked past my properties, observing the tenants and businesses thriving under my management. Each success felt deeply personal, not because I wanted revenge, but because every accomplishment represented the culmination of years of careful effort, foresight, and patience. I had built something tangible, sustainable, and meaningful from nothing but determination and strategic action. Her recognition of my success was subtle but evident. She no longer spoke with sarcasm, no longer dismissed my ideas, and never again questioned my capability. She sought guidance, advice, and even tacitly relied on my oversight in her neighborhood's commercial landscape. The transformation was complete, not through confrontation or anger, but through quiet, unstoppable growth. I also realized another truth. True satisfaction comes from the ability to act with dignity, calm, and patience, while others scramble, doubt, or struggle. There is power in quiet confidence, in letting results speak for themselves, and in maintaining professionalism even when circumstances allow for dramatic displays. The most profound victories often appear invisible to those who do not understand the effort behind them. Months later, a local business magazine contacted me for an interview about property management and small-scale investment strategies. I agreed, keeping my tone modest, calm, and professional. The interview was widely circulated, bringing subtle recognition from the broader business community, yet I maintained my quiet approach. The real satisfaction remained in the private awareness that I had created a life of independence and influence, all without the need for dramatics, confrontation, or overt revenge. I occasionally met her for coffee, casual, professional conversations about commercial trends and tenant management. She had changed, too, not only in demeanor but in understanding. She had once been a voice of ridicule, and now she was a quiet witness to what perseverance, planning, and patience could achieve. These interactions were gentle reminders of the journey from mockery to quiet mastery, from doubt to undeniable reality. One night, I sat in my office, reviewing financial statements, expansion plans, and tenant agreements. The skyline outside glowed softly in the evening light, reflecting the calm satisfaction of steady, deliberate growth. I realized fully that every moment of patience, every investment, every calculated risk, and every silent day behind the cash register had led me here. I had turned humiliation into motivation, mockery into opportunity, and doubt into quiet authority. The final, subtle victory wasn't in her recognition or in the property deal itself. It was in the quiet knowledge that my life had transformed completely, that my independence, dignity, and influence had been earned without dramatics or resentment, and that the path I had chosen would guide me for years to come. Life had revealed itself in its own perfect timing, rewarding consistent effort, strategic thinking, and the patience to act quietly while others underestimated me. In that moment, I allowed myself a soft smile, reflecting on the journey from ridicule to quiet authority. The woman who had once mocked me was now a silent witness to the results of my perseverance, and I understood finally that the most profound power is not in humiliation, confrontation, or vengeance, but in the quiet, deliberate creation of a life that commands respect naturally, inevitably, and without drama. The journey wasn't over, but the essential transformation had occurred. My life, once constrained by others' opinions, had become a testament to patience, planning, and quiet persistence, and the ultimate lesson was simple yet profound. True success is built quietly, maintained with dignity, and revealed through results that speak louder than any words ever could. By the time the 8th chapter of my journey unfolded, everything had reached a delicate balance between influence, independence, and quiet satisfaction. I had long moved beyond the days of ridicule, beyond the laughter and the whispers of doubt. My properties flourished, my tenants were happy, and my presence in the city's commercial landscape had grown quietly but undeniably. Each action I took, each property acquired, and each decision made was deliberate, strategic, and patient. The years of perseverance had crystallized into a life of stability, dignity, and influence. She continued to be a part of this world, but now with a completely different perspective. The same person who had once mocked my ambitions, who had scoffed at the idea of me leaving retail for something bigger, now approached me with caution, respect, and curiosity. There was still a glimmer of her old sharpness, but it was tempered by recognition of the reality I had quietly built. She would ask questions, seek advice, or discuss commercial opportunities, all while unaware of the full extent of my holdings. I observed her carefully, realizing how subtly the power dynamic had shifted. The irony was quiet, almost meditative, and deeply satisfying. One morning, she approached me with a particular challenge. A property she had been negotiating for months had suddenly been sold to another investor at a high price, leaving her business at a crossroads. She seemed frustrated, anxious, and unsure of her next steps. I listened carefully, maintaining calm, and offered practical advice on alternative options. I could see her weighing every word, trying to gauge the extent of my knowledge and experience. Little did she know that I not only owned a better property in the same area, but I had also anticipated opportunities like this years before, quietly preparing for moments like these. The next step, I knew, was subtle leverage. I suggested a property I owned that matched her needs perfectly, with terms that were fair yet favorable. Her eyes widened slightly when she realized how well it fit her business plans. The realization was slow but unmistakable. She was beginning to understand that I had been quietly building a foundation that now allowed me to guide, influence, and control opportunities she desired. The irony was sweet, yet I remained calm and professional. There was no need for confrontation or dramatics. The results spoke for themselves. Over the next few weeks, she settled into the property. Her boutique thrived, but now under conditions where I held quiet oversight and influence. She would occasionally come to me with questions, still unaware of the scale of my holdings, still unaware of how much I had anticipated and prepared for moments exactly like this. Watching her navigate this reality with a mixture of surprise and respect brought a profound sense of satisfaction, not in humiliation, but in the subtle acknowledgement that patience, persistence, and careful planning can quietly overturn years of doubt and mockery. During this time, I also continued to expand my portfolio. Each acquisition was deliberate, a calculated investment, a careful analysis of trends, and an understanding of long-term value. The financial growth was steady, but the true satisfaction came from control, independence, and the ability to shape circumstances quietly yet decisively. I realized fully that success was not about spectacle or dramatics. It was about consistency, focus, and strategic patience. One afternoon, she approached me directly, finally recognizing the influence I held in the neighborhood. Her tone was polite but cautious, her curiosity mixed with hesitation. "I had no idea you owned so many properties in this area," she admitted softly. I smiled gently, acknowledging her observation without gloating. "It's been a process," I said simply. "Years of planning and steady effort." She nodded slowly, absorbing the reality that her assumptions had been completely wrong. The dynamic between us had shifted completely. She no longer spoke with mockery, nor did she question my capability. Instead, she sought guidance, advice, and insight, roles that had once been reversed. The transformation was subtle but profound. She was learning, through observation and experience, that patience and deliberate action could quietly but powerfully create opportunities and influence. She had once laughed at my perceived limitations, and now she was seeing firsthand the results of consistent, thoughtful effort. It was a quiet reckoning, a moment where years of mockery, doubt, and disbelief were replaced by acknowledgement, respect, and cautious recognition. I reflected often during this period. The humiliation I had endured, the mockery and condescension had all been catalysts for action. Each insult, each whispered judgment had pushed me toward careful planning, strategic decision-making, and patient growth. The journey from being underestimated to becoming an influential landlord and investor was neither fast nor obvious, but it was undeniably effective. Then came the final, subtle twist. A property she had long desired, one that she believed was her ideal opportunity, came onto the market. She approached me, hoping I could provide advice, guidance, or insight. I listened carefully as always, and calmly offered her the option to lease a property I owned, one even better suited to her goals. The moment was quiet but charged with unspoken realization. She now understood fully that I held the keys to opportunities she had once assumed were beyond my reach. The years of careful preparation had created leverage, independence, and influence that she could no longer ignore. In that moment, I recognized the full weight of the journey. The ridicule, the doubt, the years of patience, all had culminated in a position of calm authority. I did not need to assert power aggressively. The results were evident in every interaction, every property, and every decision she now had to consider under my quiet oversight. My satisfaction was deep, reflective, and enduring. By the end of this chapter, the transformation was complete. She had moved from mockery to recognition, from doubt to cautious respect. I had moved from ridicule to quiet mastery, from uncertainty to independence and influence. And in this subtle, almost invisible shift, I realized the most profound lesson of all. The power of patience, consistency, and strategic planning surpasses the fleeting satisfaction of confrontation or revenge. Real success is quiet, deliberate, and transformative, affecting not only your own life, but also reshaping the perceptions and opportunities of those who once doubted you. Sitting in my office one evening, reviewing leases, expansion plans, and financial statements, I smiled softly. The city outside glowed in the twilight, a silent witness to the life I had built. The woman who had once mocked me was now quietly aware of the reality she had underestimated, but she had learned it in her own way, without humiliation, without spectacle, only through the undeniable results of persistent effort. I understood fully that the journey had been mine, not hers. My growth, my independence, and my quiet influence were the true victories, and in that moment, I allowed myself to feel the deep, calm satisfaction of a life transformed, a journey completed, and a subtle, powerful twist fulfilled. By the time Chapter 9 began, the full arc of the journey had started to reveal itself in subtle yet undeniable ways. Years of ridicule, mockery, and quiet planning had led to a point where influence, independence, and calm satisfaction intertwined seamlessly. My properties were thriving, tenants were happy, and the city itself had become a backdrop for the life I had deliberately built. Yet, it wasn't just about financial success. It was about the transformation of perception, of relationships, and of personal power earned without confrontation. She had changed too, though in a slower, more reflective way. The woman who had once scoffed at my ambitions now approached every conversation with a mixture of caution and respect. Her questions were thoughtful, her tone careful, and there was a noticeable humility in her demeanor. I noticed the subtle ways she adjusted her strategies after consulting me or observing my influence. It was a quiet reversal, one I had cultivated over years of patience and deliberate effort. One morning, she came to me seeking advice on a potential expansion. Her boutique was thriving, but she had hit a wall with landlords who demanded exorbitant rates. She was frustrated, stressed, and unsure of her next steps. I listened attentively, absorbing the details, asking questions to understand her position fully. Then I presented a solution, a property I owned that was ideal for her expansion. She hesitated, caught off guard. There was a flash of realization in her eyes, the subtle acknowledgement that I had quietly built a network and influence she had never anticipated. The beauty of this moment wasn't in her surprise, but in the quiet control it represented. I had never sought revenge or gloating. The power lay in preparation, patience, and the steady accumulation of influence. She accepted the property, and as she settled in, I watched the dynamics subtly shift. She was now operating in a space and context that I influenced, a silent acknowledgement of the years she had once dismissed. Over the next weeks, our interactions became routine but layered with unspoken recognition. She asked questions, sought advice, and occasionally admitted her lack of foresight in property matters. I responded calmly, offering guidance without judgment, knowing that the most satisfying transformations occur through observation, reflection, and self-realization. She didn't need humiliation. Life had taught her lessons in its own quiet, undeniable way. One afternoon, she finally spoke with honesty, almost whispering her acknowledgement. "I underestimated you. I didn't realize how much you had achieved," she admitted. I smiled softly, keeping my tone warm and reflective. "It's been a process," I said simply. "Years of steady work, planning, and persistence." Her eyes held a mixture of humility, surprise, and perhaps a subtle regret. There was no anger in me, only a calm satisfaction. The true victory wasn't her acknowledgement. It was the life I had built, the influence I had earned, and the quiet authority I now held. The months that followed solidified this transformation. She continued to operate her boutique, thriving in the space I had provided, yet her approach was now markedly different. She sought advice, listened carefully, and began to understand the value of preparation and strategic thinking. The subtle power shift was complete. I no longer needed to assert dominance or remind her of past mockery. The results of my patience, diligence, and vision spoke for themselves. During this period, I also expanded further, acquiring key properties in emerging neighborhoods, strengthening my portfolio, and quietly observing the broader market. The financial growth was steady, but more than that, it was the control, independence, and foresight that brought a deep sense of calm satisfaction. I realized fully that true power does not require confrontation or revenge. It requires patience, planning, and the quiet, consistent accumulation of opportunity and influence. Then came a moment that crystallized everything. A major investor reached out to me for collaboration on a prime development. This project represented not just a financial opportunity, but a symbolic culmination of my journey. I had moved from being dismissed and underestimated to being a recognized, trusted, and influential figure in the city's property landscape. And she, once the voice of ridicule, now witnessed, firsthand, the magnitude of the transformation she had failed to anticipate. In our conversation about this development, I could see the subtle awe in her expression. She asked questions, sought advice, and admitted her limited foresight. "I never imagined you would come this far," she said quietly. I responded calmly, without gloating. "It's the result of patience and deliberate effort. The journey matters more than immediate recognition." The truth in this statement resonated in the quiet between us. She understood now, not through mockery or humiliation, but through reflection and observation, that consistent effort, strategic planning, and resilience can quietly but profoundly reshape reality. Over the following weeks, I oversaw the development quietly but decisively. Tenants moved in, businesses flourished, and opportunities expanded, all under my careful management. She, in her boutique, benefited indirectly, but now recognized the influence I had on the broader commercial landscape. The subtle power dynamic had shifted permanently. She had once mocked me for my perceived limitations. Now she relied, to some extent, on the strategic choices I had made years before. The satisfaction was deep, calm, and reflective. I also took time to reflect privately on the journey. The humiliation, the mockery, and the years of patient planning had all contributed to the life I now led. Every setback, every whispered insult, every moment of doubt had fueled the careful accumulation of skills, knowledge, and opportunities. And now, at this stage, the results were undeniable. My independence, influence, and quiet authority were firmly established, and the lessons of patience, consistency, and strategic thinking were clearer than ever. She came to me one final time, seeking guidance on a new expansion. I calmly suggested an optimal solution, a property I owned that perfectly fit her needs. Her reaction was subtle but telling, a combination of relief, realization, and quiet acknowledgement. She now understood fully, without need for explanation or boasting, that I had anticipated opportunities, planned for growth, and quietly positioned myself for influence. The irony was complete. The person who had once laughed at my ambitions now relied, in part, on the very life I had patiently and deliberately built. That evening, I sat alone in my office, overlooking the city's skyline. The soft glow of lights reflected the calm satisfaction of steady, deliberate effort. I understood fully that the journey had been mine, not hers. My growth, independence, and influence were earned through patient, thoughtful action. The mockery and doubt of the past had become the catalysts for a life transformed. In the quiet of that moment, I reflected on the most profound lesson. Real power does not come from humiliation or confrontation. It comes from deliberate action, consistent effort, and the quiet, unstoppable momentum of preparation. The ultimate triumph is personal, internal, and enduring, a life built on dignity, independence, and quiet influence. And in that calm reflection, I allowed myself to feel the deep satisfaction of a journey completed, a transformation achieved, and a subtle, lasting reversal of fortune fully realized. By the time Chapter 10 unfolded, the journey had reached its quiet but undeniable culmination. Years of humiliation, ridicule, and doubt had been transformed into calm authority, independence, and influence. My properties thrived, tenants were satisfied, and my presence in the city's commercial landscape was no longer questioned. Yet the greatest satisfaction came not from wealth or recognition, but from the subtle, deliberate transformation of perception, both mine and hers. She had long moved from mockery to cautious respect. The woman who had once laughed at my ambitions, who had mocked my small salary and underestimated my potential, now approached every interaction with careful attention. Her questions were measured, her tone polite, and there was a humility in her demeanor I had never seen before. She sought guidance, advice, and insight, roles that had once been reversed. The irony was quiet, satisfying, but not sweet in the sense of revenge. It was the result of patience, planning, and strategic action, allowing life itself to reveal the consequences of underestimating someone quietly building their future. It was on a rainy afternoon that the ultimate realization came. She walked into my office, soaked from the sudden downpour, clutching her tablet filled with boutique financials. Her expression was a mixture of worry and hope. The property she had been negotiating for expansion had fallen through, leaving her business at a crossroads. I listened carefully, absorbing her predicament. I could see the flicker of unease in her eyes, the same unease she had once projected onto me when she doubted my abilities. I offered a solution, calm, measured, professional. A property I owned, perfectly suited for her expansion, with fair terms that would ensure her boutique's success. She paused, eyes widening slightly as realization dawned. The woman who had once mocked my low-wage job was now standing before me, reliant, at least in part, on the very resources I had quietly built over years. She didn't need a lecture. Life itself had shown her the results of my patience, diligence, and persistence. Over the next few days, she moved her boutique into the property I provided. The transformation in her demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. She asked questions, listened carefully, and began to understand the significance of deliberate planning. No more mockery, no more sarcasm, only a quiet acknowledgement of reality. She had underestimated me, and now the truth was undeniable. I had quietly become a figure of influence and authority, built entirely through my own efforts, foresight, and persistence. During this period, I also reflected on my own growth. The years of humiliation, doubt, and low expectations had fueled a resolve I hadn't realized I possessed. I had transformed ridicule into motivation, mockery into strategy, and skepticism into meticulous planning. Each step had been deliberate, each investment calculated, each decision informed by lessons learned from past failures and observations of others. The financial success was tangible, yes, but the true triumph lay in independence, dignity, and quiet influence. Weeks later, she approached me again, this time with a question about long-term leases and potential future expansion. I guided her patiently, maintaining calm professionalism. In that moment, I realized fully that the roles had reversed completely. She was no longer the figure of authority or judgment. Instead, she operated within the ecosystem I had created, quietly acknowledging the power and foresight I had cultivated over years of patient effort. The day came when she spoke directly, softly, without pretense. I didn't expect you to come this far, she admitted, her tone a mix of humility and surprise. I smiled gently, keeping my words calm and reflective. It's been a long journey, I said simply. Patience, persistence, and steady effort make the difference. She nodded slowly, absorbing the truth. There was no need for further words, the results spoke loudly enough. She had learned her lesson not through humiliation, but through observation and undeniable reality. Over the following months, my influence continued to expand quietly. New properties were acquired, tenants were satisfied, and strategic investments flourished. She continued to operate her boutique successfully, now fully aware of the network and influence I had built, yet she approached every interaction with humility and professionalism. The satisfaction was profound but quiet. It was not in gloating or revenge, but in the knowledge that deliberate effort, patience, and strategic planning had created a life of independence, dignity, and influence that could not be undermined. I often reflected on the lessons learned along the way. True power does not require confrontation or dramatics. It lies in consistent effort, thoughtful planning, and the quiet accumulation of knowledge, skill, and opportunity. Mockery, doubt, and humiliation can be transformed into catalysts for action, but the ultimate triumph is personal, internal, and enduring. By focusing on deliberate growth and measured action, I had created a life that commanded respect naturally, inevitably, and without spectacle. One evening, as I walked past the properties I had acquired over the years, I paused to observe tenants and businesses thriving under my management. Each success felt deeply personal, representing the culmination of years of careful, strategic effort. The woman who had once mocked me now operated in a world subtly shaped by the decisions I had made, without confrontation, without revenge, and without overt assertion. The subtle reversal of fortune was complete. The final realization was simple yet profound. The ultimate success is measured not by the humiliation of others, but by the quiet, deliberate creation of a life that commands respect and influence through results alone. My journey had transformed me, my relationships, and the perception of those who had once doubted me. The lessons were enduring. Patience, perseverance, and strategic effort can quietly overturn years of mockery, doubt, and ridicule. In the calm of my office, overlooking the city's skyline as the lights shimmered softly in the evening, I allowed myself a deep, reflective smile. The journey from ridicule to quiet authority, from doubt to undeniable influence, had been long and patient, but it was complete. The woman who had once dismissed me as limited and unambitious had now become a witness to the undeniable results of my careful, deliberate efforts. The irony was subtle, the satisfaction profound, and the lesson clear. True success is built quietly, maintained with dignity, and revealed through results that speak louder than any words ever could. And so, the story ended not with confrontation, not with revenge, but with quiet triumph. The life I had built was independent, influential, and deeply satisfying. The woman who had mocked me had learned her lesson through experience, reflection, and undeniable evidence. And I, having transformed humiliation into motivation, doubt into deliberate action, and mockery into opportunity, could finally rest in the calm satisfaction of a life fully realized, a journey completed, and a subtle but ultimate victory quietly, inevitably achieved.